Major David Currie stood in the street at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, the dust of battle blackening his uniform. Around him, the French village burned. 2 of his Shermans lay disabled in the crossroads. German trucks and half-tracks jammed the lanes in every direction. Small groups of infantry fought house to house, while hundreds of enemy soldiers tried to push through, or surrender. As the smoke thickened, the scale of it became clear. The Falaise Gap, the last evacuation route east for the German 7th Army, had shrunk to a single bridge over the Dive River. If it stayed open, tens of thousands would escape to fight again. If it closed, the German campaign in France could be crushed. Currie's Canadian force was cut off, low on fuel and ammunition, ordered to hold that bridge until relief arrived, or until none was left to hold it. The major reloaded, stepped into the road, and raised his pistol. For 6 hours, the entire war was about to funnel itself through a single street. On June 6, 1944, the Allies led one of the most legendary operations in the history of warfare. Hundreds of thousands of troops stormed the Nazi-occupied beaches of Normandy, charging through relentless enemy fire. Thousands fell, cut down by German shells, before a beachhead could be secured. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain, and by the end of the day, the Nazis had been driven back from the coastline. Many believed that after this decisive victory, the liberation of France would not take long to arrive. But a month and a half later, the Allies were still locked in place, straining against fortified German defenses that fought with everything they had left to keep the invaders from pushing deeper into the country. By mid-1944, however, losses mounted daily as the Allies pressed from both the west and east. The Americans knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy weakened enough for a decisive strike. That moment arrived in late July. Reinforced and resupplied, the Americans unleashed more than 1,000 bombers into the skies, tasked with pounding German defenses before ground troops launched their assault. But the weather betrayed them. Almost as soon as bombers began taking off, heavy clouds and violent winds swept across the battlefield, making it impossible for the pilots to tell friend from foe. Commanders tried to abort the mission, but communication failed, and many bombers never received the order. Payloads rained down on coordinates that had been cleared before the advance, but Allied infantry had already moved dangerously close, believing all bombers had aborted their intended strikes, and when bombs tore across the battlefield, they took out several Allied soldiers with them. The sky turned into a killing ground. Some bombers missed their marks entirely, their payloads slamming into friendly lines. Others, plagued by faulty mechanisms, released too early, their bombs scattering across ground already packed with Allied troops. In moments, dozens of fighters were gone and hundreds wounded, struck down not by German fire, but by their own comrades overhead. Yet, even through the smoke and confusion, the Germans had still been battered badly enough for the Allies to carry out their mission. With no time to grieve, American troops pressed forward across the shattered earth. The resistance was fierce, but American armored divisions, driving modified M4 Shermans, M5A1 Stuarts, and M10 tank destroyers, clawed their way through the hedgerows, slipping past defenses to strike German positions from the flank and rear. The Wehrmacht reeled, forced to fall back to avoid collapse. But for Hitler, surrender was out of the question. His generals warned him that the battle was unwinnable, but the Führer refused to listen. Even if it was the last thing he did, Hitler would seize back the ground the Americans had torn from his grasp. Hordes of Nazi soldiers marched alongside more than 100 tanks, driving toward the Allied positions. They launched their assault without full preparation, gambling on the element of surprise to tilt the fight in their favor. At first, it seemed to work, and German forces managed to claw back a few towns. But the Allied bombers were already underway to halt the Nazi advance. Swarms of RAF Typhoons and American fighter bombers swept down on the enemy columns, their cannons and rockets tearing through men and machines. In moments, any hope for a German resistance was shattered. It was exactly as Hitler's generals had warned him, but by now it was already too late. The Allied tide had been set in motion, and now thousands of German troops were trapped in the region, with little time left to escape. Further east, the 1st Canadian Army saw its moment. If they could smash through the German defenses ahead and link with the Americans pushing south, the retreating enemy would be caught and surrounded at Falaise. This would be no easy task. The 1st Canadian Army was a newly formed army, and they were asked to succeed where seasoned veterans had failed. with almost 3,000 casualties already being claimed by the German lines south of Caen. Lieutenant General Guy Simons knew that the only way to keep his men alive was to get creative. His army's artillery branch still possessed American M7 Prius self-propelled guns from the Normandy landings. Now these would be stripped and converted into armored carriers. These so-called kangaroos would serve as mobile bunkers, set to deliver infantry straight to the fight without being cut down too early. To help pave the way, bombers once again rained destruction on German strongholds, shaking the defenses before the ground assault began. With British and Polish forces at their side, the Canadians pressed forward. But even with overwhelming firepower, the advance was brutal. Dust and craters littered the terrain. German units regrouped under fire, staging counterattacks that claimed hundreds of lives. Chaos tore through the Canadian ranks. Some formations, blinded by dust and smoke, veered off course and marched straight into German strongholds, where they were cut down before rescue could arrive. The toll was more than 1,000 Canadian and Polish soldiers lost in a single push. Still, the survivors managed to claw their way forward, mile after mile, until they stood within striking distance of Falaise. Finally, they were ready to seal the trap, set to expel the Germans from Normandy. As the Canadians defined their next move, messages raced back and forth between headquarters. On the night of August 13th, under cover of darkness, a Canadian officer was tasked with leading the way to a nearby division. The Canadians knew the ground well by now, but days of shelling and bombing had reshaped the landscape. Once familiar woods had become a wasteland of charred trees and cratered earth, turning every path into a maze. Inside his vehicle, the officer swerved constantly to dodge wreckage and obstacles as he tried to navigate between the two commands. Before long, he had lost his bearings. He tried to turn back, but it was useless. He was trapped in the dark, with no idea where to go. Then a noise came from the trees. He froze, hoping it was Canadian comrades coming to guide him. But he had crossed into enemy lines. Germans emerged from the shadows, surrounding him from every direction. Escape was impossible. Almost as soon as he realized he had stumbled into a Nazi stronghold, he was gone. When the Germans searched his body, they found exactly what they were looking for: Simon's written orders for the next Allied offensive. Operation Tractable was laid bare. The plan called for a massive daylight bombing raid to smash German defenses, followed by a Canadian strike to seize Falaise. From there, joined by the Polish 1st Armored Division, nearly 10,000 Allied troops would advance toward Trun, where they aimed to link with American forces and trap hundreds of thousands of Germans fleeing the collapsing front. It was a near-flawless plan. Had the Germans remained in the dark, the Allies might have been able to achieve it with little resistance. But now the Nazis were onto them, and that same night they deployed 500 grenadiers, 15 tanks, and a dozen 88mm anti-tank guns into position, waiting for the Allies to come. Operation Tractable began the next day. In the half-light of morning, Canadian troops crouched in the fields, weapons primed, waiting for the signal to attack. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to shake as explosions ripped through their ranks, hurtling men into the air. At first, they thought the Germans had sprung a last-second ambush, but then the sky itself thundered. The fire was not from the enemy. It was their own airmen, bombing their positions by mistake. Over 800 British Avro Lancasters and Handley Page Halifaxes had lifted off, fanning out toward 7 pre-selected targets where the bulk of German defenses were believed to be holding. To avoid areas plagued by enemy anti-aircraft guns, pilots flew straight over friendly lines. Some crews even abandoned the crucial time run check from the coast and released too early. Once again, the Allies were starting out their operation with a painful, self-inflicted blow that cost them about 150 men and 241 wounded. However, for those who survived, there was only one choice left: shake off the dust and keep moving. Every minute lost brought the Germans closer to escape. Although the Allied bombing raid had taken nearly 400 soldiers out of action, it had also smashed chunks of the German defenses guarding the approaches to Falaise. That damage gave the Canadians and Polish just enough of an edge to press forward and unleash a barrage against the enemy positions ahead. Still, the Nazis would not yield a single inch without first putting up a fight. Every Allied charge was met in kind. Heavy tanks from the Panzer battalions swung their turrets toward the attackers, blasting apart formations until advancing groups were scattered or downright annihilated. Lieutenant General Symons had hoped that even with the early setbacks of the operation, the line at Falaise would crack quickly. But as the first day of Operation Tractable slipped away, his men still hadn't broken into the town ahead. At night, the Allies returned to the drawing board. The bombing raids had crippled part of the German formations, but they'd also cost the Allies dearly. To call in more bombers would be to risk devastating the front lines, and Symons was resolved not to let this happen again. Instead of relying on bombers, he summoned ground reinforcements. These were mainly waves of infantrymen who would throw their weight behind the armored divisions and hammer their way into Falaise. For a full day, the battle for Falaise raged without pause. Rifles cracked, cannons thundered, and soldiers found themselves face to face before a storm of bullets coming their way as they came out from their covers to try and land a clear strike against the Nazis. The Germans fought with everything they had left, refusing to yield even an inch, while the Allies poured in fresh men to replace the fallen, grinding forward step by step. At last, the defenders cracked. The Allies surged into the streets of Falaise, only to find a ghost town. Buildings shattered, homes empty. Only die-hard Waffen-SS units remained, resolved to fight to the end in the ruins of the collapsing city. Once the final sparks of resistance were stamped out, the Allies had no time to rest. With Falaise secured, the next phase of the operation was to begin immediately, leading the battle-worn men even deeper into the region, toward Trun, where they would finally be able to close the pocket before the retreating Germans could escape. Canadian and Polish battle groups fanned out toward Trun, striking from multiple directions and securing the ground that would set the stage for the final blow. Victory seemed only an arm's length away, but no soldier was allowed to relax. The Wehrmacht, even cornered, was still deadly. Everyone knew a counterattack was coming. And on August 18th, the Nazi strike finally came. Although large-scale bomber raids had dwindled since the operation's start, British Hawker Typhoons still prowled the skies, skimming low over the battlefield, raking enemy lines with 20mm cannons and tank-busting rockets. Most of the time, they flew unchallenged. But that day, Canadian infantry holding a makeshift trench watched in horror as a German anti-aircraft shell shrieked upward and smashed square into one of the fighters. The engine was gone. The pilot coaxed the crippled plane into a glide, searching desperately for somewhere, anywhere to land. At the last moment, he spotted a haystack. Coming in at nearly 150 miles per hour, the Typhoon slammed into it. The impact was brutal, but miraculously, the pilot survived. Rifleman Arthur Bridge remembered the chaos vividly. He and his comrades rushed to pull the downed pilot clear before German fire could reach him. Furious, the Nazis unleashed a storm of mortars onto the trench, which, as Bridge later stated, quote, can be a very unpleasant experience on the receiving end. The shaken pilot could only exclaim, quote, "Let me out of here and back in the air where it's safe." Despite the occasional loss of a plane or harassment of ground troops, the battlefield was slipping from German hands. The same day the Typhoon was brought down, news came through. Trun had been liberated, and Polish battle groups had fought their way to the foot of Hill 262, the vital high ground they desperately needed to gain control of the region. The next day, Canadian and Polish forces joined with the Americans, and the Falaise Gap was finally closed. With thousands of German troops trapped inside the Allied encirclement, the price was too high for them to simply give up. Even with defeat closing in, the Nazis prepared one final push, hoping to smash through the lines and escape before capture became inevitable. Allied commanders anticipated the move and ordered their men to secure the most likely escape routes. Among these was the small French commune of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, near the center of Normandy. Its bridge over the Dive River offered a crucial crossing point for a German breakout. Canadian companies reached the area before the Germans. However, not all of them were aware that within hours they would be standing in the path of a flood of enemy soldiers determined to break free. Rifleman Arthur Bridge recalled marching with his comrades through villages barely 400 yards wide as they made their way across the region. Burned houses, overturned cars, and shattered farms littered the roads. Some barns were already packed with German prisoners who had surrendered when the Canadians first arrived. Although the scene was gruesome, as the men passed through, a strange calm settled over them. They drank rum, sang songs, and one even pulled out a battered accordion. For a fleeting moment, they almost felt safe. Then, in the dead of night, the first German fire shattered this brief moment of peace. Bridge and his unit scrambled for cover, racing through the darkness as they realized enemy troops were everywhere, scattered in pockets, fighting to carve a path to freedom. A direct clash would be impossible until they regrouped, so the Canadians abandoned the main roads, slipping instead through side routes and narrow tracks. As troops made their way toward a nearby village they could use for cover, they stumbled upon a group of German tanks lying in ambush, cannons aimed and ready. Luckily for the Canadians, in the dark, friend and foe blurred, and as the Canadians passed, not a single shell was fired, the enemy likely mistaking them for their own. However, the Canadians knew luck would not save them twice. Soon, they would have to face the full weight of the German push. Reaching the village at last, the Canadians dug in, taking positions inside abandoned houses, rifles fixed in the road ahead. Sleep was impossible. Every man sat tense, waiting for dawn. When the first light crept through the mist, they finally heard the grinding of wheels. A tank was rolling straight toward them. The Canadians at Saint-Lambert had no formal anti-tank defenses, but that didn't stop Company Sergeant Major Mitchell George from drawing his pistol and barking to his men as the tank approached. Every rifle swung toward the sound of grinding treads growing nearer. For a moment, none of the men in the formation dared to breathe, certain that these moments would be their last. But then, as the vehicle emerged from the mist, a collective sigh of relief swept the ranks. It wasn't German. It was an Allied South Alberta Sherman, lost in the haze. For a moment, the Canadians believed they still had time to prepare for the counterattack. That illusion was gone almost immediately. An armor-piercing shell slammed into the Sherman. Flames erupted as a German tank, hidden behind them, opened fire. The tank crew scrambled to escape, but the gunner was trapped inside. Ignoring the enemy fire, Sergeant George leapt onto the tank. With bare hands, he forced the hatch open, while his men dragged the wounded gunner free. However, the rescue came too late. The soldier's injuries were fatal. The German tank assault was followed by hundreds of German troops storming toward Saint-Lambert, unleashing a storm of machine gun fire. They cut down Canadians as they tried to evacuate their wounded. If the region were to be held, the Allies would need additional forces. Commanders got to work, assembling a new armored battle group tasked with serving as the Canadians' main line of defense against the incoming attackers. The force was commanded by Major David Currie, who braved across miles of contested terrain alongside his troops until they arrived at Saint-Lambert. The situation was not good, yet Currie was not intimidated. Upon giving the order, his tanks fired in unison, their cannons blasting German positions and shattering entire battle groups before they could break into the village. It's estimated that Currie's forces managed to neutralize about 7 German tanks, 12 88mm anti-tank guns, 40 vehicles, and inflict around 2,000 casualties. Still, the enemy refused to yield. The fighting spanned into the night. Under the cover of darkness and rain, some German soldiers slipped past the Allied lines, vanishing into the countryside. The Canadians didn't chase them. They knew their strength had to be saved for the greater waves still pressing forward. In the blackness, the sound of tanks loomed from every direction. Gunners fired blindly into the void, hoping instinct would guide their aim. Arthur Bridge later recalled one moment when a soldier simply pointed into the dark and pulled the trigger. Against all odds, the grinding of treads ceased. At dawn, they confirmed the strike upon finding the wrecked tank. 2 lifeless Germans were still inside. Gradually, the German tide broke. For those who failed to slip through Saint-Lambert, giving up their arms was the only option left. As Bridge later remembered, quote, "Some of them needed a little encouragement, but many were quite willing to surrender." However, Saint-Lambert wasn't the only place at risk of being overrun, and while Canadians had fought tooth and nail to hold back the Nazi tide, the Polish were locked in a bloody campaign of their own at Hill 262. They'd carved out strong positions around the ridge, but the enemies approaching them were no disarrayed German units desperate to escape the pocket. These were hardened Panzer divisions, calculating every move, determined to smash open the Allied ring and carve a corridor wide enough for tens of thousands of Germans to escape. Polish gunners poured out round after round as the Nazis closed in, burning through their ammunition until their weapons nearly ran dry. And still, the enemy did not stop coming. Despite their number falling by the hundreds, the Germans knew that this assault would be their last chance to make it out of France before the Allied trap closed in on them. And so they kept pushing. In minutes, a lone German tank cut down 5 Shermans, its cannon fire echoing across the entire ridge. Each time the Polish beat back one thrust, another slammed into a different flank, as if the ridge itself were under siege from every direction at once. Before long, the Nazis finally got their way. In the northeast, a shattered Polish position had left a gap wide enough for thousands of Germans to flood through. By the hour's end, nearly 10,000 enemy troops had slipped out of the pocket. If the breach wasn't sealed quickly, the entire Allied operation could collapse. Despite the fragile position, the Polish still had one weapon left to exploit, a high ground position they could turn into the Germans' worst nightmare. From the ridge, Polish guns raked the narrow passage below, tearing through convoys of men and tanks. It was a massacre, yet the Germans did not wait too long before striking back at the Polish position above with everything they had. The Polish held through the incoming fire, but by nightfall, their situation had turned dire. Exhausted and nearly out of ammunition, they knew they could not keep the fight going for long. In that moment, a Polish commander turned to his men and declared with a grim tone, quote, "Gentlemen, everything is lost. I do not believe the Canadians will manage to help us. We have only 110 men left, with 50 rounds per gun and 5 rounds per tank. Fight to the end. To surrender to the SS is senseless. You know it well. Gentlemen, good luck. Tonight we will die for Poland and civilization. We will fight to the last platoon, to the last tank, then to the last man." Gradually, the Germans clawed their way up toward the Polish defenders holding the high ground. The Polish had no choice but to unleash the last of their tank shells against the oncoming enemy. Soon, Germans and Polish were face to face, weapons raised at point-blank range. Both sides were battered, drained after days of fighting across the scarred fields of Normandy. Yet no man could falter. The next moments would determine whether Operation Tractable failed or succeeded. Gunfire cracked back and forth in a final exchange. Soldiers hurled themselves behind trees as shells splintered the trunks, only to re-emerge and fire again into the smoke-filled terrain. By the time the last shots echoed, the ridge was littered with bodies and shattered weapons. It had been a merciless campaign, but against all odds, the Polish were the last ones standing. Not long after, Canadian reinforcements finally broke through, and the Falaise Gap was sealed once again. The cost had been drastic. Thousands of Allied lives, and nearly a third of the German forces had escaped. Yet when the guns fell silent, the Allies could still call it a victory. Tens of thousands of German prisoners remained, and most importantly, Normandy was secured. With their new foothold, the Allies could now prepare for an even greater push into France, and just 1 week later, on August 29, 1944, Allied troops marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées. France was free, liberated in no small part thanks to the men who held the line to the last bullet at Operation Tractable.